Is the iPhone 14 Pro that big of a camera upgrade from the iPhone 13 Pro as Apple claims? Or are they simply not telling us the whole story? Well, I'm sad to say that we were shocked when in our 32 tests, in some cases the iPhone 13 Pro was actually better than the 14 Pro. Also, quick disclaimer, the iPhone 14 has the same main camera as the iPhone 13 Pro, so if you're struggling to decide between the 14 and the 14 Pro, this video will also answer that. Okay, starting off with this outdoor shot, we took this to see the color rendition of the red car, and I gotta say, they were both too vibrant. The 14 Pro even more so these were not the most accurate. The 14 Pro was a bit wider, that's thanks to the 24mm lens compared to a 26, but other than that, these photos were basically identical. Then we have a proper HDR scene, and unfortunately both blew out the sky. Not so much for the 14 Pro, that was a tiny bit better. The 14 Pro was also sharper slightly if you zoom into this tree area on the right. And the same applies to the plants and the grass. The 14 Pro was a bit sharper than the 13 Pro. And then we have another HDR scene, same story as before, they're almost identical. The 14 Pro is a tiny bit wider, the fence is actually sharper, the one on the left, and the same applies to the plants. They are also sharper on the 14 Pro, but other than that, no major differences in terms of outdoor shots. Then we tested out the RAW capabilities. So we simply used the default camera app and we took a Pro RAW photo, and then I edited that photo to make it look as good as it could be. And since the iPhone 14 Pro took a 48 megapixel RAW, we have significantly more detail. So the image is sharper, we have less noise in the water, the color reproduction is just beautiful, so this is a major upgrade for the iPhone 14 Pro from the 13 Pro. We also have a much better dynamic range, and if you take a look at the sunset itself, we also have more shades of orange, the clouds have more detail. And a quick discovery that I just found, if you take a 48 megapixel RAW photo in low light, the iPhone would default to a 12 megapixel RAW, even if you have 48 megapixels selected. Moving on to some indoor shots to see the improvements to the Deep Fusion engine. And here, the iPhone 14 Pro is indeed sharper if you look at the plant on the right. It also has slightly more natural colors in this photo of Ren. The plant on the left is also a bit more detailed, but it does seem to be overly sharpened. So yeah, not really a fan of that. Now, in this second indoor shot, the iPhone 14 Pro has a slightly cooler tint. There's also more detail in the flooring, significantly actually, if you take a look at the fabric on the seats. So we can indeed see Deep Fusion 2.0, which is that photonic engine essentially, do its work here quite nicely. And I think that the improvement in sharpness is also thanks to the smaller aperture, f1.8 compared to f1.5, so I think that also makes a difference. But then we tested macro, and this was actually a major improvement. As you can probably tell, the 14 Pro is significantly sharper. This is thanks to the smaller aperture once again, which provides a sharper focus. So if you take a lot of macro shots, then the 14 Pro is a really nice upgrade. Then we tested out the zoom. So we first tested the 2x zoom. For this, the iPhone 13 Pro uses the main 12 megapixel module and then zooms in digitally. The 14 Pro crops into the main 48 megapixel sensor and uses the middle 12 megapixel area of it. And because of that, it is definitely sharper. So if you take a look at the Oliver Cromwell text and the statue in general, it is noticeably better than the 13 Pro. Then we tested out 5x. We picked 5x as this would be a bigger difference than the jump from the 2x to the 3x would be. And besides, when they're both using 5x, they're actually using that 3x telephoto module and then zooming in digitally. And once again, we do have more detail on the iPhone 14 Pro. So if you take a look at the text, you can actually see the specks of dirt much easier on the 14 Pro, although the difference is smaller than before. And then of course we had to test 10x zoom, and here there was a pretty big difference between the two. So if you take a look at the brickwork texture, the clock and even the trees behind, all of them are noticeably sharper on the iPhone 14 Pro compared to the 13 Pro. And I did check, and they were both using their 3x telephoto modules here, which is very interesting how Apple was able to just extract more detail from the telephoto module on the 14 Pro compared to the 13 Pro. Maybe they are using some of the data from the 48 megapixel sensor to add more detail, although I couldn't really see any evidence of that. Now, when it comes to the outdoor ultrawide, I gotta say the image processing is really bad on both. So the sky is blown out almost entirely, slightly less on the 14 Pro, but still bad. The 13 Pro's ultrawide does seem sharper though. So if you take a look at the right-hand side of the road and the grass, it is sharper. And yeah, overall the 13 Pro does have the clear ultrawide, which is interesting. And same applies with this second ultrawide shot that we took. Overall, we do have more detail in the 13 Pro shot. So if you take a look at the pavement on the left, it is sharper on the 13 Pro. If you take a look at the buildings far ahead, those are also sharper on the 13 Pro. The 14 Pro is once again worse, and we really don't know why. And then we took one last ultrawide shot, this time indoors. And here, once again, the 13 Pro was better. We had less noise on the 13 Pro, the floor was sharper, although Harry's jeans were indeed sharper a bit on the 14 Pro, but overall, the 13 Pro had the better image. Now, when it comes to video, they both max out at 4K 60, and the quality was extremely similar on both. The only differences that I've noticed was that the 14 Pro was a tiny bit more stable. This was thanks to that second-gen censorship technology, but just very slightly. And then if you pause the videos, you'll notice that the 14 Pro was sharper overall. But yeah, only one paused. When it comes to ultrawide video, once again, same story, almost identical on both. Slightly sharper on the 14 Pro, but only if you pause the video. Other than that, these were basically the same. Now, something that I was really curious to try was the new action mode. And I gotta say, when you're walking, it looks very similar to the 13 Pro, but once you start running, wow, the 14 Pro looks incredible. Like, it looks unreal. It looks as if we had it on an actual gimbal, which we obviously did not. And I actually tried stabilizing the 13 Pro footage in Final Cut Pro, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get it anywhere near the level of stabilization of the 14 Pro. So this is just incredible. Now, cinematic mode also gets an update with the 14 Pro, being able to shoot in 4K 30 as opposed to 1080p 30. But aside from the resolution, which was a bit noticeable, but not as much as I expected, there isn't really that much of a difference. So the background separation was almost identical to the 13 Pro. The colors were a bit better though on the 14 Pro. So you can see that my hair is darker on the 14 Pro compared to the 13 Pro. But other than that, these were basically the same. Then we tested out portrait mode using Ren as our model, and also the 3x zoom module. Both were set to their default blur level, which was f4.5, but for some reason the 14 Pro blurred everything apart from Ren's nose. We did get this gradual blur, which was quite nice, but simply just not realistic compared to the 13 Pro. The blur was way too much. So yeah, the 13 Pro definitely takes this one. However, the nose was actually sharper on the 14 Pro. Then here's a portrait mode shot of a person, me, also in 3x, and here they're both really good. We have some great background separation, but once again, the 13 Pro is better. It is sharper if you take a look at my hair, and the separation is a tiny bit better on the 13 Pro. And then we tested out night mode, but this time indoors, you know, your typical indoor shots in low light. And here I couldn't really see any difference in sharpness. So the 14 Pro did have a brighter carpet, but other than that, these two photos were identical. So definitely not the 2x improvement in low light that I was expecting. Now, in this actual night mode shot, the biggest difference is the color temperature. So they both got it wrong, but the 14 Pro was much closer to how this looked in real life. The 14 Pro had slightly more detail in terms of the brickwork, but if you zoom in a lot into the building in the center, you can see that the 13 Pro was actually more detailed. So I would say that this is a tie. Then in the second night mode shot, we have some very similar results. So the 14 Pro was indeed sharper when it came to the bricks, but it simply looks like it over-sharpens in post rather than in pre. And if we take a look at the tree, this is also sharper on the 14 Pro, the one on the right. But yeah, overall, there's a very small difference between the two. 14 Pro slightly takes this one. Then we did one more nighttime shot, but this time we actually manually maxed out the timer, which was 5 seconds on all of them. And in this case, the 14 Pro was better, the fence was sharper, the ground was sharper, so yeah, we had much better color reproduction as well on the 14 Pro. I still wouldn't call this the 2x improvement in low light that Apple was claiming, but it is definitely better than the 13 Pro. Then we tested the 3x zoom lens in low light using night mode, and the 13 Pro was once again sharper. So if you zoom in on the right hand side of the bridge, you'll be able to see that. But interesting enough, when we took our second photo, the 13 Pro actually messed up really heavily here, as it simply used the main module and then cropped in digitally rather than the 3x zoom module like the 14 Pro did. So the 14 Pro did better in the second test. We also tested the 10x magnification using night mode, and here the quality was very similar. The 13 Pro actually had less noise, so overall it was a better image. And we took this again, by the way, and for some reason it was even noisier on the 14 Pro this time, but it did have more detail. So hopefully Apple fixes this with the iPhone 14 Pro because it does seem like a bug. Now, in terms of the ultrawide lens in low light, once again, the 13 Pro seems to have more detail. So if we take a look at the van, this is sharper, the tree is sharper, the ground is also sharper. The 14 Pro is a bit brighter, but again, we honestly cannot see that 3x improvement in low light that Apple was claiming. It's simply not there. In fact, it's worse than the 13 Pro. We also tested out night portrait mode, and it turns out that you cannot actually use the 3x module with portrait mode and night mode at the same time. Now, of course, portrait mode shots are normally taken with a telephoto module, and in this case, they both look horrible because of the lack of a night mode. The 13 Pro was actually better, surprisingly. So here we go, this is how they look at 1x, which uses night mode and portrait mode at the same time. But the 13 Pro was, again, better. Yeah, really don't know what's happening here. So what about night video? Do we finally get to see those 2x improvements that Apple has promised us? Well, not really. So the 14 Pro is sharper, but only when you pause the video. So same thing as with the daytime video. But other than that, these are basically identical. So same level of noise reduction, same level of brightness, everything is basically the same. Moving on to the front-facing camera tests. So in this one, the iPhone 14 Pro is sharper. Once again, notice how the background, so the leaves, are actually clearer on the 13 Pro. This is because of that smaller aperture. But other than that, I'm not really seeing that much of a difference between the two as I was initially expecting, thanks to the larger aperture and the autofocus that we now have on the 14 Pro. Moving on to the front-facing video, I'll just let you guys watch this. Okay, so this is a front-facing video from the iPhone 14 Pro and the iPhone 13 Pro. Let me know which one looks better, also which one sounds better. This is the audio coming from the iPhone 14 Pro, and now this is the audio coming from the iPhone 13 Pro. So I did find the 14 Pro to be better here, sharper and with slightly better processing, although the difference wasn't as big as I was expecting. But then in terms of the audio, I found the 13 Pro to sound better. Moving on to the front portrait mode, this was pretty good on both. The 13 Pro seems to once again have slightly better background separation if you take a look at my hair and the overall sharper image on the 13 Pro. So yeah, the 13 Pro takes this one as well. And now we have the front-facing camera in low light using night mode, and yeah, this is pretty bad on both. The 13 Pro definitely has less noise. On the 14 Pro, my jumper was sharper, but if I were to post any of these, I would honestly post the one from the 13 Pro. We did actually take another example of this outdoors. This time, the 14 Pro messed up terribly. Like, I don't know what's happening there. The image is literally breaking apart. The 13 Pro was very noisy too, so I don't know what happened here. Probably just the light reflecting on the camera, but yeah, these look horrible in both situations. Okay, so in conclusion, the iPhone 14 Pro had better outdoor shots, although the difference was very minor, with better processing, a wider field of view, and slightly sharper, but I wouldn't really say that this is a reason for you to upgrade. A major reason to upgrade would be for that 48 megapixel Pro RAW. I think that was incredible, and this is my favorite camera feature of the new 14 Pro. There were indeed some improvements in terms of deep fusion, which were good to see indoors, but again, not enough to warrant an upgrade. The macro improvements were really nice to see, so if anything, that's also another reason to upgrade, because you do get a much sharper macro with the 14 Pro. Video had a small upgrade on the 14 Pro, but that was only visible when you actually pause the video. And then action mode, that was incredible. That is a true reason to upgrade. So action mode, the macro improvements, and RAW, these are the main reasons to actually upgrade to the 14 Pro's camera. But then the Ultrawide was actually better on the 13 Pro in both daytime and nighttime. Portrait mode was also better on the 13 Pro. Night zoom was also better. Audio overall was better on the 13 Pro. So yeah, I'm honestly surprised. The 13 Pro should not be better in any case, but for some reason it is. And at the same time, when it comes to the night mode improvements, I was expecting a big upgrade here based on Apple's claims of 2x and 3x improvements, but we didn't see anything like that. And even when it comes to the HDR processing, a lot of people were complaining that the 13 Pro was overexposing the sky, and I was hoping that that would be fixed with a 14 Pro, but it seems like it's basically the same. Stay tuned for the iPhone 14 Pro versus the S22 Ultra camera comparison. That's going to be a very interesting one. I'm Daniel, and I'll see you guys in the next one. ZONEofTECH, signing out. Cheers.